All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lacanian Scotland's March event. So as you can see, I'm not Callum. Callum usually hosts our events, but unfortunately could not be here today. So I'm chairing this event, and I usually help out with the tech stuff at these things. But Oliver is running that by himself today, so do bear with us if things don't run smoothly. Also, Oliver, out of interest, is the only one in the UK right now. So Lacan isn't quite in Scotland today, but so in America, it appears. But I am happy to be hosting this particular event as I am a great fan of Stephanie's work. So our guest speaker, Stephanie Swales, is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Dallas, a practicing psychoanalyst, a licensed clinical psychologist, and a clinical supervisor located in Dallas, Texas. Her latest book is co-authored with Carol Owens and is entitled Psychoanalyzing Ambivalence with Freud and Lacan, On and Off the Couch. But today, she's here to talk about negative empathy in the Lacanian clinic. So Stephanie, thank you so much for being here today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. It's my pleasure. So Barack Obama, both in his time as a US senator and as a president, voiced his concern not about the federal deficits, but about our empathy deficit, which he saw as a bigger problem. In a commencement speech in 2006, referencing, quote, the child who's hungry, the laid-off steelworker, the immigrant woman cleaning your dorm room, end quote, he claimed that we, quote, live in a culture that discourages empathy, end quote. Obama, of course, is far from alone in recent decades in his suggestion that hostilities between groups regarding religion, race, gender, sexuality, and so on would be ameliorated if only we as a culture could cultivate more empathy. Even more broadly, in today's time, empathy is seen as a cornerstone of socio-emotional learning and childhood development, a central component of the successes of the helping professions, and at the heart of good interpersonal relationships of all sorts. Especially since the dawn of neoliberalism, the field of psychology has generated a wealth of research regarding empathy. Following the societal superegoic call to empathize with thy neighbor who is different from thyself, there are even a plethora of self-help books lining the virtual shelves, such as this book here, The Empathy Effect, 7 neuroscience-based keys for transforming the way we live, love, work, and connect across differences, or Emotional Intelligence for Sales Success, connect with customers and get results. In Lacan's capitalist discourse, the structural necessity of subjective division is denied through claims that there exists an S1, a master signifier, functioning in the place of truth, that answers the distress and dissatisfaction of the split subject. Capitalism in our age thus fabricates the belief that the subject's discontents are not inherent to the structure of subjectivity, but instead simply due to not having obtained the right S1, the right product or experience that would enable a state of full subjective satisfaction. Capitalism, via its conduits such as advertising, finds ways to create demand for an S1, for example, a product such as the newest iPhone, so that subjects, of course defined as consumers under neoliberalism, assign to their suffering a lack that is perfectly complemented by that iPhone. The customer is duped and dupes himself into thinking that the purchase of the iPhone will bring a full state of subjective satisfaction. Should the consumer be in a position to obtain the newest iPhone, he will explain away its inevitable disappointments and, fueled by renewed discontents, begin the search anew for another, better S1. This is why Lacan remarks on a continuous loop on which the capitalist discourse runs that burns the subject out. Capitalist discourse then promotes the semblance of dissatisfaction, emphasizing subjective discontents, at the same time that it fosters fantasies of self-sufficiency and completeness. As such, we can see that the subject under the sway of capitalist discourse can even relate to empathy as an S1. In an age whose dissatisfactions are described by many as isolation and disconnectedness on the one hand, and xenophobia on the other, empathy is packaged as just the right social glue for the job. What's more, under neoliberalism, empathy is advertised attractively. By taking this seminar, purchasing this book, you will be more empathic than your fellow worker and therefore win the promotion over her or him. So empathy then is paradoxically touted both as a technique that will give you a cutting edge in your career and at the same time as the healing balm that soothes the aches and pains resulting from relating to your fellow worker as competition. In the realm of the talking cure, empathy is considered to be the cornerstone of effective psychotherapy, as well as most branches of psychoanalysis, excluding, of course, Lacanian analysis, where there's a notable lack of conversation about empathy. Patients in couples therapy often cite a lack of empathy for one another as the root of all of their problems. They fantasize that if only their partner could understand them, put themselves in their shoes, then their relationship would be a happy one. In other words, the hope of receiving perfectly attuned empathy can all too often function as an S1. In our contemporary moment, patients often enter into the various forms of the talking cure with a transference to what might be described as the subject supposed to be empathic. Many patients seek, above all, an empathic therapist, someone who will truly understand them. This expectation of the therapist as a purveyor of superior empathy can even outweigh any belief that the therapist has any useful knowledge, typically expected, of course, in the form of cognitive and behavioral skills, and certainly an initial transference of the subject supposed to know something about the patient's unconscious is a rare breed indeed. Even if the patient is not operating via the discourse of the capitalist, it's part of the human condition to want to receive empathy or to be understood. Analysts frequently speak about wanting to be seen, recognized, and understood by the likes of friends, lovers, parents, and certainly the analyst is no exception. We may ask, however, what kind of empathy results when, in Lacan's words, quote, the very foundation of interhuman discourse is misunderstanding, end quote. So for one thing, the analysts' plea for others, including their analyst, to empathize with them is often not purely and simply what the analyst desires. Owing to the dynamics of the unconscious and the transference, the analyst might consciously believe they just want to be understood and empathized with, but unconsciously desire to be misunderstood. Perhaps such an analyst experienced being misunderstood by their parents, who isn't, and at some level derives jouissance or enjoyment from feeling victimized in this way, perhaps even getting a false sense of freedom that they can be themselves as long as the other person doesn't truly know or understand them. So similarly, should the analyst give in to a demand of the analysans, including a demand for empathy, the analysand may feel frustrated, disappointed, angry, for instance, that the analyst didn't reach the desire behind their demand, didn't read the desire behind their demand. So then the desire to be empathized with is one which should not be homogenized or universalized when we speak of it, as if everyone just straightforwardly wants to be understood all the time. Empathy in and of itself is not a moral category and does not imply any particular notion of the good. You can try to understand someone as a way to enact harm, for instance, to manipulate them, just as you can try to understand their experience in order to be in a more informed position from which to offer them aid. Even with good intentions, however, as Lacan teaches us, social projects that rely upon empathy, such as anti-bullying programs, social projects that operate by way of the master's discourse, have failure and even harm written into their very structure. his comments about the philanthropist, etc., the aggressiveness that underlies philanthropic activities, especially if enforced by way of the master's discourse. So the bottom line here, however, is that empathy is not a moral category, and we have to be motivated for some reason to engage in it. So typically that motivation is some variation of love or hatred. So what is empathy and how can it be employed? Empathy is a way of understanding something about the other's experience and also a way to form a social bond. As such, empathy can be used in various ways and with a number of different motivations within each of Lacan's 5 discourses, including, I will argue, in the discourse of the analyst. Within mainstream literature on empathy, there's a huge number of definitions, but for the sake of brevity, I'll share there tend to be 2 kind of main types of empathy. So one, emotional empathy, which means roughly feeling what another person is feeling as if you were that person. And 2, cognitive empathy, which means awareness of another person's thoughts or perspective and or feelings, or thinking what another person is thinking as if you were that person. So sometimes emotional and cognitive empathy coincide, and at other times they're relatively separate. Empathy of either type has been considered anathema to Lacanian psychoanalysis because the practice of empathy is considered to involve an imaginary order fantasy of the possession of accurate knowledge of another's experience, a kind of delusion that you know. I will argue, however, that while emotional empathy, so feeling what one imagines one's analyst feels, is by and large something to be avoided, there are versions of cognitive empathy which can have a place within the discourse of the analyst. So kind of a brief historical review here, very brief. Freud's few brief comments on empathy were either in reference to the field of psychology as distinct from psychoanalysis, or to humor, for instance, in his jokes in their relation to the unconscious. In group psychology and the analysis of the ego, Freud said, quote, "A path leads from identification by way of imitation to empathy. That is, to the comprehension of the mechanism by means of which we are enabled to take up any attitude at all towards another mental life," end quote. So, as such, for Freud, identification is the condition for the possibility of empathy, of knowing or feeling something of the other's experience. It sounds like he's making it really important. Despite this broad claim, empathy has an extremely marginal role in Freud's work, and he doesn't speak about empathy being an important tool for the analyst. Almost 2 decades after humanistic therapist Carl Rogers began promoting empathy as the primary epistemology of an intervention in the talking cure, self-psychology founder Heinz Kohut was one of the first psychoanalysts, alongside Ralph Greenson, to make empathy a priority in psychoanalytic technique. Kohut defined empathy as, quote, "the capacity to think and feel oneself into the inner life of another person," end quote, and as such constitutive of the fundamental mode of relatedness between analyst and analysand. For Kohut, the essence of the psychoanalytic cure involves, quote, 2 separate, identifiable, but interdependent steps. 1, empathic understanding, arrived at through vicarious introspection, and 2, explaining, end quote. So interventions that communicate empathy are correspondingly heavily emphasized in self-psychology, and obviously Lacan wasn't very keen on that, and much less explaining clearly what one means. So Kohut does emphasize that the motivations behind empathy are paramount. In his final lecture before his death, Kohut characterized empathy as a value-neutral investigative activity that could even be used for malevolent purposes. Self-psychology is far from the only analytic tradition emphasizing empathy's importance. It's now hugely popular with many other types of psychoanalysis, with the relational, intersubjective, and ego psychology schools. According to prominent contemporary psychoanalyst Nancy McWilliams, so she's a notable synthesizer of psychoanalytic traditions, in the practice of, quote, the psychoanalytic sensibility, end quote, identification and empathy play central roles. So McWilliams sees the attempt to understand the analysand as part and parcel of the psychoanalytic cure, and empathy as the main instrument that we have toward that end. Using Freud's definition of empathy, from a Lacanian perspective, a path leading to empathy from identification by way of imitation clearly resides on the imaginary axis of experience. Whether the empathy is cognitive or emotional or both, because identification is an unconscious process that colonizes the other's experience in accordance with the empathizer's own perspective, empathy has the potential to be harmful in analytic work, or at the very least, obstructive. I'll give you a moment here to read this caption. So, believing one understands the analysand means to operate in the position of the master and via the master's discourse, which can shut down free-floating attention and curiosity about the analysand and their unconscious, as well as enacting a kind of violence to the other's difference. It's worth mentioning that what I call imaginary order empathy, it's most often directed at the imaginary of the analysand. So that is most often directed to their conscious egoic experience and intentions. And this focus in and of itself is a departure from the analyst's primary activity of listening to the signifier and to manifestations of the unconscious. That being said, imaginary order empathy, or empathy the analyst uses from their position in the imaginary axis, which, again, Lacan was not so keen on, to say the least. So imaginary order empathy can also take into account the split subject and be directed towards the unconscious. Either way, imaginary order empathy operates when an analyst believes in what seems on the surface to be true about the other's experience, forgetting in so doing that such understanding is made possible through making an interpretation based on their own perspective, whether more personal or theoretical. It's coming from the narcissistic perspective of the analyst. Whenever we imagine we understand the otherness of the other, we deny the non-rapport of the sexual relationship and the misunderstanding that lies at the very foundation of interhuman discourse. The real as the impossible to know or to symbolize is at the center of human experience. It is, however, impossible for any analyst to completely avoid imaginary order empathy, the experience of which can surprise even the most seasoned analyst. We sometimes slip out of the position of the analyst and imagine we understand the analysand's experience. And it's of the utmost importance to catch oneself in the act in what is ultimately a fantasy of believing one knows or understands something about the analysand, and to find a way to put that empathy back under the bar in the position of truth in the discourse of the analyst. Sometimes, if the analyst finds themselves repeatedly engaging in imaginary order empathy with a particular analysand, they might need to seek supervision in order to return to listening from the position and the desire of the analyst. So again, empathy is not only an epistemological method, but it's also a way to form a social bond that can operate within any of the 5 discourses. So just owing to the constraints of time, I'm going to turn now to speak to the two key discourses to consider when it comes to the practice of psychoanalysis in relation to my discussion of empathy today. So first, in the discourse of the hysteric, the agent formulates complaints, the top left-hand corner here, the split subject, and searches for an other who is presumed to have an answer, so S1, the master figure, for what bothers the subject or the agent. So this discourse represses the truth that all desire rests upon a lack that cannot be alleviated, the object A and the bottom left, and typically results in the production of narratives, S2, that don't solve the fundamental lack, but instead engender further irritation. So the arrow going from S2 up to the split subject again. So this, says Lacan, is the optimal discursive position for the analysand to occupy. However, it's crucial that the analyst not believe in the fantasy of the hysteric and mistake themselves to be a true uncastrated master who will be able to heal the analysand's discontents with this or that masterful interpretation, or by way of providing empathy that is superior to the empathy that their parents gave them, which is popular in other analytic traditions, this idea of sort of reparenting in a way through superior empathy. So whether implicitly or explicitly, we could say that the hysteric's discourse often involves a demand to the master figure for empathic understanding of their subjective suffering. This is important to remember in the context of psychotherapy and psychoanalysis, of course, whether or not the patient has a hysterical structure. Lacan says that all speech is a demand for love at some level, insofar as it's a request for the other to pay attention to you, to listen to you, and perhaps to give a response. So I think it's here that the overlap with empathy is clear. Insofar as the analysand is the one who speaks, they demand love and empathy. Fantasies of complementarity, fused love, belong in this discourse as well. So understand my experience even better than I do, even without my having to put into words what it is I want from you, and so on. If, as in other analytic traditions, the analyst should make an empathic intervention by translating something of the patient's experience into their own words, this would correspond in the discourse of the hysteric with the production of S2 or new knowledge. The analysand always feels, if this happens, that that's not quite right. The empathic narrative misses the mark. Hence, in this discourse of the hysteric, knowledge occupies the position of painful surplus jouissance. But what happens when a Lacanian analyst responds to the hysteric, or the analysand whose desire has been hystericized, not with their own empathic understanding, but instead with, aside from silence, that being the most common Lacanian intervention, responds with repeating back the analysand's own words. Such a Lacanian intervention is not the production of S2, it's not the production of a new narrative or empathic understanding, but instead repeats back certain of the analysand's own signifiers in an invitation to say more and to hear their own words in a different way from another perspective, with respect potentially to the other scene of the unconscious. At the same time, however, it's my contention that repeating back the analysand's own words can sometimes have the effect on the analysand of feeling understood, of feeling as though the analyst empathizes with them. So this brings me to a brief review of the discourse of the analyst and how, in addition to what I've just mentioned, empathy could potentially play a role in the practice of Lacanian psychoanalysis. And indeed, although they might shudder at the thought, many Lacanians might already be practicing their own forms of empathy, but without recognizing it as such. Going to be very unpopular after this talk. All right, in the discourse of the analyst plays the role of the object A, incarnating a present absence for the analysand as other. The object of the drive, or the object cause of the other's desire, might in this sense operate via the silence of the analyst in response to the analysand's question. What do you think? This initially confusing response pairs with other interventions that don't align with the expected provision of knowledge or ready-made solutions to create a radically non-reciprocal social bond in which the analysand can articulate subjective division. The analysand is not only a divided subject in the sense of suffering, like the agents in the discourses of the hysteric or the capitalist, but in the sense of being a subject split into conscious and unconscious processes and lacking in jouissance. The analyst attends to the singularity of the analysand by bracketing their psychiatric and even psychoanalytic knowledge in order to allow the master signifiers, S1, that mark the subjectivity of the analysand to be formulated. And so the production of master signifiers are made possible by the knowledge that motivates the discourse of the analyst, the knowledge that the analyst has to bracket or set aside their knowledge. So knowledge occupies the place of truth under the bar, meaning that, quote, the analyst has to ignore what he knows, end quote, as Lacan says. And as I've said, to use empathy as an S2 in the practice of analysis is one way to slip back into the discourse of the master, which Lacan notes is very easy to do. Whenever the analyst uses the intervention, say more, or otherwise encourages the analysand to speak, the analyst engages in the essential analytic act of avoiding producing meaning themselves, but supporting speech. So the position and desire of the analyst within the discourse of the analyst provokes and inspires the analysand to take up the ethics of the well-spoken, of speaking well, l'éthique du bien dire. On the analysand's part, this involves going against the passion for ignorance and doing the work of analysis. So exploring manifestations of the unconscious, putting oneself, one's life, one's symptoms into question. In order to help the analysand take up Lacan's ethics of the well-spoken, the analyst practices what I would call l'éthique du bien écouté, or the ethics of listening well. The analyst listens attentively with careful attunement to the letter of the signifier, the structure of the address, repetitions, negations, and with an ear towards the other scene of the unconscious. This listening becomes evident in many ways to the analysand, including, not least of which, the analyst's memory for what has been said. Analysands in Lacanian analysis likely feel empathized with in accordance with the analyst's practice of the ethics of listening well. So in other words, analysts don't have to intentionally be practicing empathy in order to produce the effect of analysands feeling that they're receiving empathy from the analyst. On a related note, of course, it's worth mentioning that analysands will feel that their analyst empathizes with or not in relation to their transference at any given moment of the treatment. Some analysands are prone to assuming the analyst understands their experience, while others are prone to believing the analyst doesn't have a clue or perhaps is too different from them in terms of gender identity, age, backgrounds of class, culture, race, education, and so on, to be able to understand them. Likewise, over the course of treatment, the analysand can go from believing the analyst understands them more intimately than anyone has ever empathized with them before, to feeling profoundly unseen and misunderstood. More centrally, however, what I'm arguing is that the position of the analyst in Lacanian psychoanalysis itself involves a type of empathy, though not in any traditional meaning of the term. Any empathy that emanates from the position of the analyst on the symbolic axis is what I call negative empathy. Sense empathy is about knowledge or understanding of the other's experience. And as we have said, the analyst cannot believe that they understand. Empathy, again, seems at odds with the practice of Lacanian psychoanalysis. So in this vein, I think it's important to remember Lacan's three primary passions. So love, hate, and the passion for ignorance, which I've already mentioned. So for the analyst, having undergone one's own analysis affects a transformation of the passion for ignorance. This transformation enables, on the one hand, a new relation to the real, or to the limits of the symbolic, corresponding to knowing that you cannot know. And on the other hand, this transformation opens up a curiosity, a stance of questioning or interrogation of experience, both one's own and that of the other, the analysand. This transformation of the passion for ignorance in the person who becomes a psychoanalyst results in what I call negative empathy. So paradoxically, practicing negative empathy involves knowing that one cannot know and listening to the analysand in their absolute difference, motivated by a deep curiosity about them. Recall that different forms of empathy result, and with different effects, depending upon one's motivation for empathizing and the discourse in which one is instantiated. Within the discourse of the analyst, the motivation is ultimately the desire of the analyst. But in relation to the practice of empathy, it's worth speaking to the key components or some key components of the desire of the analyst, as stemming from the transformed passion for ignorance. And also, I'd like to bring your attention to what Lacan says at the end of Seminar 11. He refers to as a limitless love corresponding to a desire to obtain absolute difference. So here he says, the analyst's desire is not a pure desire. It is a desire to obtain absolute difference, a desire which intervenes when, confronted with the primary signifier, the subject is, for the first time, in a position to subject himself to it. There only may the signification of a limitless love emerge, because it is outside the limits of the law. If to love is to give what you don't have, to give from your lack, then to desire with the analyst's desire, as a desire to obtain absolute difference, meets this definition of love. It is in this atopia of desire, this position of lack, of taking up the role of the object A, that the signification of a limitless love can emerge, because it is outside of the limits of the law. So this limitless love is neither imaginary nor symbolic, but of the order of the real. The limitless love of the analyst is therefore, like the real, the impossible. As such, the analyst's desire is not just a desire, but one that corresponds to a type of love, a love of absolute difference, which, like anything in the real, is impossible to actually obtain, as well as the love of a particular analysand's difference. I'd like to mention that I'm currently finishing a book manuscript on this subject, on the subject of empathy. What I'm presenting today is just part of the arguments in the book. And perhaps at the risk of being even more at odds with the Lacanian community, I recently conducted a qualitative research study on empathy. This was undertaken with my co-authors, Chris Bell and John Roberts, also Lacanian scholars. So we conducted a reflexive thematic analysis of our interviews of 12 Lacanian analysts regarding their notions of empathy, how they might or might not use it in their analytic practices. So I'll be presenting just a few quotations from those interviews and what follows. And we will have a follow-up study that will focus on analysand's experiences of receiving empathy or not from their Lacanian analysts. So stay tuned. Okay, so as I have intimated, it's my claim that aiming for negative empathy is part of the desire of the analyst. So in order to explain further what I mean by negative empathy, I'd like to point out that knowledge, S2, in its position of truth in the analyst discourse, does not mean that the analyst can or should throw out all of their knowledge out of the window when practicing analytically. Instead, knowledge and savoir-faire motivate the process of analysis, but without rendering this explicit. Yes, the analyst listens carefully to the singularity of the analysand's speech, practicing free-floating attention, but of course the analyst does so in accordance with their theoretical training and experience as an analyst. One listens to the letter of the signifier with a particular attunement to manifestations of the unconscious, negations, and the like, in accordance with their knowledge about structural diagnostics, what sort of interventions can help progress the analysis. So, likewise, although more centrally the practice of negative empathy is part of the desire of the analyst, and as such is a desire to know something about the imaginary, symbolic, and real of the analysand, while at the same time accepting the non-rapport and the limits of understanding. Practicing empathy, negative empathy, can at times result in a certain set of S2s, certain set of narratives, knowledge of sorts, non-knowledge, which are bracketed, put into question, and held under suspicion, but yet can inform the analyst's way of listening to and intervening with a particular analysand. In this manner, the products of negative empathy are put under the bar in the position of truth in the analyst's discourse, set aside along with our theoretical knowledge, but yet a part of what it means to practice Lacanian analysis with any particular analysand. These S2s, I argue, have a different status than one's personal opinions, beliefs, experiences. It's, of course, absurd to imagine that one can practice analysis without having done any theoretical reading or watching YouTube videos or participating in Lacan in Scotland lectures, engaging in supervision. And I think that the results of these belong alongside the products of negative empathy in a sort of kind of useful subcategory of S2 in the discourse of the analyst. So via negative empathy as a component of the analyst's desire, the analyst has a desire to uncover, reveal, or punctuate something of a particular analysand's experience that the analyst registers as potentially important, yet knows cannot be fully understood, neither by the analyst nor by the analysand. Negative empathy is part of the questioning stance that the analyst takes in analysis. So in this way, the practice of negative empathy involves knowing that you cannot know, but registering and remembering the signifiers, the partial objects that dominate and structure the analysand's experience. So it results then in a non-knowledge, not an understanding, but a registration and memory for something that seems to be key to relating to the analysand at any given moment, to listening to the analysand at any given moment. Negative empathy then involves aiming at all three registers of the other's experience, real, symbolic, and imaginary, and as such is part of the non-rapport or the social bond formed in the discourse of the analyst. Negative empathy results in perspectives regarding how an analysand is structured in their singularity, not on what the analyst imagines about the analysand's experience, but on the signifiers and the structure or form of the analysand's address. So these perspectives on the structure of the analysand's singularity are fluid. They're subject to questioning, to revision. So for instance, for some months, you hear the analysand's master signifier of middle being related to being the middle child, to getting in the middle between people and conflicts, always being in the middle of things, never completing them. But then you begin to also hear the analysand speaking about being middling or being average, and even having too big of a middle or a stomach. So on another level, the level of the real, we might say that the perspectives generated by negative empathy do not stop being written. They influence the real of the non-rapport between the analyst and analysand. So the perspectives that result from negative empathy structure how the analyst positions herself and intervenes in the analysis. Traditional notions of empathy operate in the master's discourse on the imaginary axis, as I've said, both in and outside of the session room. Such notions of empathy assume a subject that is not split, a subject that knows itself, or they tend to, and thus the empathic reflections that psychotherapists use can be said to be either accurate or inaccurate, depending upon how well it matches with the patient's conscious experience. So in contrast, Lacanian psychoanalysts' empathy is structured by their perspective on the nature of subjectivity, that is, the split subject, the subject of the drives, a subject that is fundamentally in conflict with itself. It's in this way that the practice of negative empathy can be directed, as I've said, towards each register of the analysand's experience, imaginary, symbolic, and real. So as I conclude, I'm turning now to briefly review what negative empathy might look like when aimed at the conscious egoic fictions of the analysand, aimed at the unconscious, and aimed at the real. So negative empathy aimed at the imaginary. So negative empathy, again, can inform the analyst's way of listening, and it can also inform their way of intervening. There are certain instances in which a Lacanian analyst's interventions might actually bear some similarity to the empathic reflections used in other traditions, although typically not using the analyst's own words. Perhaps especially in the early stages of the work, analysands place importance on the analyst understanding their conscious intentions and conscious experience. Like, I meant to say this. If the beginning analysand lacks just a basic sense that the analyst understands what the analysand is trying to say or trying to do, then they might leave the treatment. As such, depending upon the analysand, it can be important to communicate that in some fashion while still maintaining the position of the analyst. So such interventions are made from the position of the analyst on a symbolic axis, but in the spirit of play, of playing with the semblant of the master who understands without being duped by this play acting. In other words, although typically the analyst is listening for manifestations of the unconscious, parapraxes, negations in speech, gaps in someone's narrative, and so on, Lacanian analysts must also have a sense of the lived experience of the analysand, especially at the beginning. So generally speaking, such an empathy can assist the analyst in recognizing the shifts that occur over the course of the analysis in the analysand's self-perceptions and worldview. Still further, negative empathy aimed towards the analysand's imaginary can help inform interventions. For example, an intervention as it initially occurs to the analyst might be judged as too castrating at that moment for the analysand to metabolize, so such that to avoid provoking defensiveness and aggressivity, the analyst decides to phrase the intervention differently or wait until another opportunity arises. Negative empathy aimed at the symbolic. So sort of as a bridge here, another way of expressing empathy for the analysand's conscious experience is one which is in the service of helping the analysand to speak more about what doesn't fit into their self-picture. So the analyst might say something like, this is being very general, but I hear you saying that this is difficult. You're saying this is difficult. It makes you anxious and stressed. So thus expressing empathy for the conscious experience. But at the same time, another part of you seems driven to put yourself in this position. So the recognition of the analysand's egoic fictions then sometimes helps them to explore the other scene of the unconscious if you're kind of giving both in the same intervention, both sides. So as such, this intervention is informed by the analyst's negative empathy for both the conscious and unconscious, or both the split and the ego sides of the analysand as a divided subject. On other occasions, negative empathy might be aimed toward the symbolic to the exclusion of the imaginary. So perhaps you witness the beginnings of the hysteric's crocodile tears. You hear them saying for the 100th time how the other doesn't understand them. So by way of your theoretical knowledge and your negative empathic stance towards your individual analysand, you perceive something of the jouissance of the drives erupting, unacknowledged by the analysand, and hope to make a cut in that jouissance, which can open up a space for the unconscious, for the analysand to question their experience. In another sense, we might think of symbolic order empathy as an empathy for the logical moments of the structure of analysis. These logical moments begin with the difficulty of the demand for analysis, arising from a place of suffering, and then continuing with the difficulties of speaking and doing the work of analysis before shifting to the termination phase. In our empathy research study, who we're calling Analyst 7, even spoke of symbolic order empathy as potentially involving, quote, an identification with something about the process of analysis, the intensity of it, the difficulty of it, what allowing yourself to really be in the position of the object for the patient, and the range, especially after many years of practicing, the range of what patients do or bring about you, that becomes really important in terms of my, I don't know, like strength to keep going. And I don't know, it's an empathy with the person who's committed to analysis and to, you know, this psychoanalytic business. So negative empathy aimed at the real. So finally, I'd like to speak about this aspect of negative empathy, which involves wanting to know, but knowing that you can't know the impossible, while at the same time understanding that at some level, something of the real is operating. So first, we can think of negative empathy aimed at the real of the analysand that has effects on the real of the analyst. The analyst has an embodied sense, or potentially even a dream about an analysand, that something important is going on that goes beyond what is possible to put into words. This dream or embodied experience of the analyst is interpreted by the analyst as a response to something of the real of the analysand. So, to use yet another term unpopular with Lacanians, such an experience could potentially be qualified as countertransferential. It is, however, not implicated in what other analytic schools might consider to be an enactment, whereby something of the analyst's own symbolic or real unconscious is triggered by something of the analysand's impossible. Actually, I think we have time for this example here from our study. So in this vein, Analyst 3 provided an example of real order empathy that corresponded to having dreamt about an analysand, which she said was an unusual experience for her. It's not happening all the time. They said what mattered in the dream were some signifiers that had to do with his name and his father's name. What I learned was, coming back to Freud's early notion, for which he was also criticized very much, that the unconscious is timeless, is a timeless register, so that we can anticipate at some moments, things that the patient may end up doing, and that's what happened in the dream. The death of the subject, which was configured in the dream. And, it had to do with the analyst's fall from this position of the subject supposed to know. So in that sense, it was a lesson to me. And it was an indication of how to position myself in the treatment and a kind of reminder. And that was enigmatic and interesting. And if you want, as a form of empathy, because it's a form of the unconscious, reading the situation that has not yet revealed itself as such. And to give another quote, Analyst 1 spoke of empathy and the real as, quote, being an experience of registering through the body and through senses, through the being, the being of the analyst, some residue, some trace of what the analysand brings to the work. I don't mean a trace of what's in them, meaning the analyst. I just mean a trace of what it evokes in the analyst. And then analyst one says, it's always interesting to me when I dream about analysans. So there were two speaking about quotes I've given, speaking about the embodied sense, but also dreams. Let's see. So the second type of negative empathy aimed toward the real, which may be intertwined with the first, is directed to something that is presented at the level of the body. The analysan's body or movements, or in one example from our research study, literally an object that the analysan brings to sessions. At times, this sense of negative empathy toward the real can correspond to the typical way in which Lacanian analysts are attuned to eruptions of or traces of the real and attempt to get the analysan to signify them. Analyst one provided the following example, which I will end with. They say, this is a woman who for years, when she came to work with me, she brought a cup of coffee with her. And I can't even remember her ever drinking the coffee. She put it down on the coffee table, and then she'd set about the work. It was with us for years. I stopped seeing it even. And there was a point where she wanted to change her job. And because she was really kind of floundering around what it was she wanted to do, I asked, and what would be important to you? And she said that there's a coffee shop nearby. And again, there's just this moment of, I must have just glanced at the coffee table and it just came out of my mouth. I said, how near? She said, preferably in the same building, preferably down the hall. And then she brought in a dream after that session in which she hears her father coughing down the hall. And in that session, I remember saying coffee. He coughed, E. And I wasn't planning on it. I had no idea what it might connect to for her. And she spun around and sat up and looked at me like, what? And again, that was a really, really crucial moment. So at some level, the coffee cup had registered over and over again. And another part of me, I was just completely stupid about it. So I'll conclude by saying that my sense is that for the most part, the concept of negative empathy, insofar as it can be seen as a component of the desire of the analyst, it seems to me to be consistent with what many Lacanian analysts are already practicing. And my hope is that we can bring Lacanian psychoanalysis into the conversations occurring about empathy in other schools of psychoanalysis, including our critique about imaginary order empathy.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was really, really great and interesting. So yeah, Callum usually kicks off the Q&A session with a couple of questions himself, or usually profound questions, but I thought I'll just go with some regular questions and then we'll open things up to the audience. So if you want to ask a question, you just use the reaction button, raise your hand, leave your hand up, and we'll bring you into the spotlight if you have your video on, which would be great. And yeah, we'll lower the hand for you. Because you mentioned on the last point about the real and the body and literal objects like the coffee mug, do you think there's a difference in empathy and negative empathy for online analysis versus in-person analysis?
That's a great regular question, Amanda. So as it happens, that was one of the questions we asked in our research study of the interviewees of the Lacanian analysts. And by and large, I mean, really the answer was no. They made the differences are just different analysts' relations to what it is to work online versus in person. And as we know, there's varying preferences and stances on that. But one thought would be, that the imaginary, right, has sort of a different appearance or experience in online versus in person analysis. I mean, so do the other registers, right? But they're still there. But ultimately, I would say the answer is no. So at least some of my work is virtual still, and I'll say that it just always depends on the particular analysis and what comes up. So my thought is no, but I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are on that, or what other people have to think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I guess some people would say that, oh, well, you can't, maybe it relies a bit more on the analyst and kind of, saying what's surrounding them. Like the coffee mug, you would not necessarily see if they're drinking
Right.
anything or if they have anything. But
And
at the
actually, sorry, just to
no,
interrupt, the analyst who gave that vignette commented as much. That if it had been online, she would have never known that was a part of what this person was bringing to sessions. So yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. But I guess then there are other instances where you're in a typically in your own maybe home or in a particular environment where something happens there that kind of becomes part of the analysis. So which might not have happened if you went to the analyst office. What I can't think of any good examples, but so I guess you also have stuff that happens online, like in the analyst surroundings that can't. So yeah, different
Just
choice.
different scenes for
Yeah.
sure. I just was speaking with my supervisee with and she just speaks to me about her couples analysis work, and there's plenty of couples who decide to have their analysis sessions on the marital bed, which they're bringing into the picture to be seen and recognized. So there's, no matter what, you have different things to play with.
Yeah, exactly. My other question was why the choice of the word negative empathy?
Yeah, I was, struggling with that. Uh, really, I've been researching empathy in and outside of analytic traditions for a number of years now. And to be honest, it's almost annoying how many terms there are for it, and definitions. And, we can put certain things into, like categories of larger categories. And it's a confusion of tongues. But insofar as most other analytic traditions just speak about empathy as a term, and then maybe have their own definitions of it, but they're using the same word. I thought it would be helpful to add a signifier to the word that maybe surprises people a little bit. What is it to it's not negative in the sense of being something that's unpalatable or disliked, even if traditional Lacanian stances don't like it. It's more that it's kind of an inversion of what's typically understood by an empathic stance. So for me, it's part of, as I said, the way of forming the social bond within the discourse of the analyst. It's part of that position, and it can be directed, at the imaginary, symbolic, and real faces of the analysand's experience. But the negative, I think, is important to capture something of the non-rapport, and the not knowing, but this transformed passion for ignorance, this questioning, this kind of wanting to know, knowing that you can't know. So yeah, I don't think there's any term that's perfect. And if anything, my saying like negative empathy aimed at the symbolic can be sort of cumbersome, but I wanted to get something that sort of made a cut into the master signifier of the term empathy itself. And so I thought negative would be a good way to do that.
Mm-mm. No, it was definitely surprising because I thought it was going to be about something completely different.
What did you think?
Well, like negative as in terms of how empathy can be a negative thing in analysis. Yeah, so that's kind of what I thought you would be talking about. But then introducing
Which I
that,
did say, but yeah.
yeah. But I guess that's the point. So disrupting the whole thing about negative empathy is disrupting our understanding, right? So I like that. And yeah, my the other question, probably last question that I wanted to ask was you mentioned it was contentious as well, and how does a Lacanian how do you orient yourself in using, I think you said reflexive thematic analysis, right? That you used for the study. Yeah. How does that sit with a Lacanian? Because yeah, thematic analysis, it does obviously depending on how you use it and stuff, but is it a bit more about pinning down meaning rather than disrupting meaning? So yes, how do you orient yourself around that?
Yeah. Thanks for bringing back attention to another aspect of how I'm going to be unpopular, Amanda.
You can cut it
Well, I will say, that, uh, so, I'm an associate professor. I am in academia, but I'm also a practicing analyst, and that these are two different stances and at least two different discourses in which I participate, and that our colleagues at Ghent University in Belgium are actually doing a huge amount of um, qualitative research that covers the area of Lacanian psychoanalysis, both the practice of and stances on psychopathology. And I think that that's a real contribution. Um, so, Dries Dolster, Stan Van Hula, and others over there have published things that, in international psychoanalytic journals that are read. They're not just Lacanian journals; they're read by other analysts, and so spreading the good anti-word or something. I think you sort of have to speak in a language in which other people outside of the Lacanian fold are going to listen in order to potentially have effects. And I am seeing that in the States over here. There's a special issue. Derek Cook, Jameson Webster, Stain, and others contributed to Lacan in America of the American Psychoanalytic Society's journal that just came out a few months ago. And that's, Lacan was never a thing in that journal until now. So I'm seeing, perhaps there being more of a place, not just in academia, film theory and philosophy and all of that for, Lacanian psychoanalysis, but also in, yes, it's journals, right? It's academic journals, but that analysts read, practicing analysts read. So getting into this conversation, I think is helpful. I'm teaching for the Dallas Psychoanalytic Center, which is until very recently been like ego psychology all the way. And my sense is that there's kind of a changing attitude towards the practice of Lacanian psychoanalysis being crazy and something nobody else understands, and I think that's in part anyway, due to Lacanians kind of speaking these various other languages. So I think doing research studies is one way to do that. And the reflexive thematic analysis itself, we analyzed from the perspective of Lacanian psychoanalysis, from this theoretical perspective. So there's no way to, outside of, I think, the analytic situation, where an analyst is there with an analysand, to respect the singularity of the other. Whenever we're getting outside of that, of course, if you're, listening very carefully, attending to, what 12 analysts say, you're gonna find a way to restrict it in some way to come up with these themes or sort of generalize. But we tried to include as many quotes as possible, kind of differences of perspective. And again, these are Lacanian analysts, so they're naturally speaking about theory as well as practice. And so, it's not an atheoretical, there's no such thing, thematic analysis.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely on board on making it more accessible via these ways, and it's not it doesn't have to be a huge difference in terms of, we're always finding themes in terms of, things that people say that we're singling out as important. And yeah, that's part of everyday language and analysis as well, right? Yeah, and sorry, I had to ask because I was also curious, being myself new to academia and orienting myself as well, and being discouraged to do Lacan, of course, and more the traditional methods, as you know. But yeah, thank you. We can open it up if people have any questions. So just raise your hands, keep them there, and we can bring you in, or you can just use your audio, or even you can write in the chat if you have a question and you didn't want to speak. So anything works. Patrick?
So fairly, well, not really straightforward, but kind of basic question. How would you position your account of empathy in relation to transference? That's the first part of the Lacanian or even Freudian account of transference. And the second part of the question, I'm interested in what you. So I'm interested in the notion of attunement, which I'm not sure I know too much about, but I believe kind of arises from the work of Daniel Stern, among others, possibly. But yeah, which seems to be a kind of connected concept to, or idea to, connected to empathy. So transference and attunement, I guess, is my question. Sorry, I'm in the dark here. I'm very dark on the screen.
No problem. And hopefully my answer won't keep us too much in the dark about your questions. But I'm not quite sure how to respond to the empathy in relation to the transference beyond to say that I think it's necessarily a part of every transference. Kind of, unless you have a more specific question, but what I've said is that it was kind of universally part of the demand that the analysand presents to the analyst, implicitly or explicitly, directly or indirectly, understand me or misunderstand me. And that's depending upon, a particular analysand's transferential position, they're going to, want or not want empathy, or imagine that you're giving it to them, or that you're not giving it to them, or that you totally misunderstand them. And so, that's just, it's sort of one important face of the transference. Do you want to get in and ask a sub question there? Or?
I'm not sure. I suppose. Well, I I don't speak as an analyst, but rather as a patient, as an analysand. And I guess if there is a sub question, it's I wonder if my experience is that my analysts, for example, attempt or efforts to empathize with me, which I understand as being to feel with me, or feel what I'm feeling, or understand what I'm feeling and feel it themselves, is irritating, in the sense that what I want, and not me in particular, or perhaps it is me in particular, I don't know, is not them to feel with me, but to give me the knowledge that I suppose them to have about me. So more on the level of knowledge, I guess, rather than, I mean, I know that's a kind of illusion in some ways, but rather than feeling with, and I guess in some ways I suspect that where you were going with negative empathy was to try and interrupt that kind of supposition. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure if that, but so I suppose is about, feeling out affect. I think there's a moment in Lacan where he says, he refers slightly pejoratively to, in French it would be tout ce frotti-frotta affectif, all this kind of emotional, I'm not sure how to translate that, emotional flummery. So I suppose it's about the relation between emotion or affect, I guess, and knowledge that, sorry, it's not very clear, but
no, that's a good question, at least insofar as it makes me think of things to say. So I mean, my general thought, theoretically, is that what I'm defining as a negative empathic stance that goes along with the desire of the analyst excludes trying to feel what they imagine, what the analyst imagines the analysand is feeling. So it excludes emotional empathy.
Okay.
But of course, analysts might be having some sort of affect themselves, depending upon the moment of the analysand's, session, what they're hearing. But certainly we wouldn't intentionally be like, okay, I'm going to try to feel what the analysand is feeling. If that happens, it's generally there's a warning that you're in the imaginary, and you want to kind of check that. What I'm speaking of as a negative empathic stance is more along the lines of it's not cognitive empathy, but on that side of things. And one example, so something I didn't really stress so much in this talk, but empathy is often conflated with caring. And I think especially so when we're talking about emotional empathy, that at least we imagine that if the other or we ourselves are empathizing, it involves this, affective sort of sharing of experience, that somehow magically bridges the non-rapport. Patients come to me sometimes from having had often other types of, psychotherapy or even psychoanalysis. And that is a common thing that I'll hear, that it annoyed them. Stop trying to feel what I'm feeling. You're wrong, and this isn't what I want. Other times I've heard from, it just depends on the transference. I've heard from them that, they wish I did that. I'm so cold. And, their former therapist wear their heart in their sleeve, and they could really tell, you know. So I think ultimately it's about what we as Lacanian analysts view as helpful to the progression of the treatment, and not so helpful. And the imaginary relating on that axis is really key to this conversation. But quickly, I'll give one example. I think in Lacan, could be argued in Lacan's own practice. So in Rendezvous chez Lacan, the film, there's a clip of Suzanne Amel, a former analysand of Lacan's. She speaks about her experience, with him, and she said, she's speaking about that being under, Nazi occupation, and being a child, I believe, of the Jewish faith, who just, every day at a certain time would just be inundated by, the Nazis are doing their rounds, trying to find, the Jewish people. And anyway, but just in general, the master signifier of Gestapo just invaded her experience with a lot of suffering, even 40 years, or maybe not that much, but even much later. Actually, I think she was saying 40 years later, when she was recounting what Lacan had done, so he's hearing her, speak about this great suffering and fear and anxiety. And he gets up out of his chair, he comes over, and he, gently, this is a well-known example, he gently touches her cheek. And it's geste à peau. It's a gesture, a touch of the skin. And so it was a transfer, it's absolutely aimed at the real, but using a transformation of the same signifier, so that, she said it was a tender gesture, I think. She said something like that. And it surprised her, right? It's disrupting something about her relation to this master signifier. And she said, she's not, it didn't make it less painful what had happened to her, but she had a different relation to it. And so, we could say that there was maybe a kind of negative empathy that Lacan had about her position in relation to this master signifier, and the imaginary order, conscious, egoic suffering that came with it. And he wanted to shift that, right? So I don't see, she interpreted it as a kind of care. And maybe it was, we don't know. But I would doubt anyway that he was in this, Gestapo, feeling emotional empathy for her at that time. I would doubt that very much, that he was in the throes of imagining, something that he couldn't possibly imagine, right? Her experience.
Thanks.
So,
I could shut up. I just had a follow-up question, if that's okay. So it's going back to Amanda's question earlier, really, about the difference. So does it make a difference if you are with the analysand face-to-face, or there is a different kind of positioning? I mean, I suppose I'm thinking about in the room, in rather than online. But I suppose online makes it very much face-to-face, or whether that the negative empathy that you're exploring is more enabled by the disruption of that face-to-face kind of confrontation. The analysand, or the analyst rather, sorry, in a different position somewhere else, who is not, therefore not directly in front of, two people staring at each other or kind of confronting each other face-to-face. Is the physical positioning of the analyst important in this dynamic?
Of course, any physical virtual positioning is important somehow, and I don't think I have an answer terribly different from what I gave to Amanda in relation to her question. But just to emphasize that, of course, there are versions of what it is to be on the couch, online, where the analysand is laying on the couch and can't see the camera, or being on the phone or something like that. It's not the same, but you're not always face to face virtually, just like you're not always face to face in the session room.
All right, thank you, Patrick. So do we have time with one last question? I think from Brian. Is that okay, Stephanie?
Of course, yeah.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie, for such a wonderful talk. And I did read your paper as well, I guess earlier today, and that was also very enjoyable read. I always enjoy any of the talks that you've given. I like the way that you deliver them in sort of, well, this might, you brought it up a few times, how you might be disowned for certain things that you do by Lacanians, and that you make things very comprehensible. So I appreciate that. I was wondering, and I'm sorry if you talked about this earlier in the talk. I arrived a little bit late because I am a bit of a Luddite. I was wondering if, in terms of what's going on politically and socially, with COVID, I don't know how long it is that you've been working on this topic, but whether in examining what's going on in the social and political world, you've also noticed a kind of uptick maybe in the demand of analysands coming to you and asking for this, asking for empathy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Brian. Very generous of you. And yes, as it happens, I began my talk with speaking to that. Yeah, I think it is an age of the subject supposed to be empathic, and I think the rise of predominance of neoliberal discourse does go hand in hand with the increase in empathy being a kind of master signifier of our times. But empathy in a way that's that of course it doesn't work. I guess I'll just kind of spin off from that just a teeny bit, just to say, and if you're referencing my paper in Arai, the Journal of Critical Psychology, perhaps, I think speaking to the political dimension, contemporary life outside of the space of the psychoanalytic session room is important. But of course, this negative empathy depends upon there being an individual person, and you're taking up, the stance of the analyst, taking up the position of the, playing the role of the object A, the trashitas, the acting like a saint, and it can't be done outside of, on a political level, on a mass level. But absolutely, there's an uptick in analysands patients expecting, empathy, and then as analysts, we have to deal with that somehow. We have to keep them in the treatment, but without giving in to the demand.
All right, thank you, Brian, and thank you so much, Stephanie, for that. That was really great and insightful, and can't wait to read the book. So again, thank you so much, Stephanie, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, everyone. My pleasure.